I paid off a $170,000 debt for my son to save his family. I gave them my house so they could start over. The next day, they sold the house and left the country. My daughter-in-law left a note. "Loser old woman, you stink. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was watering my roses. Neil's voice was strained, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. At 68, I thought I'd heard every possible tone from my son. But this was different. This was the sound of a man drowning. "Mom, I need to see you. Can I come over? It's urgent." I set down my watering can, my arthritic fingers trembling slightly. "Of course, sweetheart. Is everything all right?" There was a long pause, then a sound that might have been a sob. "No, Mom. Nothing's all right." Neil arrived 20 minutes later with Avalon trailing behind him like a shadow. My daughter-in-law had always been beautiful in that sharp, calculated way that made me uncomfortable. Today, she looked different, though. There was something predatory in her green eyes, something that made my stomach tighten with unease. "Hi, Colleen," Avalon said, her voice honey-sweet but somehow cold. She kissed my cheek, and I caught a whiff of expensive perfume that seemed too strong, too deliberate. Neil couldn't meet my eyes. He slumped into my kitchen chair, the same one he'd sat in as a boy when he was in trouble. His hair was disheveled, his usually pressed shirt wrinkled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Tell me what's wrong," I said, pouring coffee into my best china cups, the ones I saved for special occasions, though this hardly felt like one. "We're in trouble, Mom. Deep trouble." Neil's voice cracked. "I made some bad investments, really bad ones. The house is in foreclosure, and the lawyers are saying we could lose everything." My heart clenched. Neil was my only child, my everything since his father died 8 years ago. The thought of him struggling, of little Emma and Jake, my grandchildren, being homeless, was unbearable. "How much?" I asked quietly. Avalon spoke up, her manicured fingers wrapped around the coffee cup. $170,000? That's what we need to stop the foreclosure and pay off the immediate debts. The number hit me like a physical blow. It was almost exactly what I had in my savings account. Money I'd carefully accumulated over 40 years of marriage, supplemented by Harold's life insurance and the small pension from his years at the factory. "Mom, I know it's a lot," Neil said, finally looking at me. His eyes were red-rimmed, pleading, "but I don't know where else to turn. The kids are asking why we're looking at apartments, and I can't tell them we might end up in a shelter." Avalon's hand moved to Neil's shoulder, a gesture that looked supportive but somehow felt performative. "We've exhausted every other option, Colleen." Neil's too proud to ask, but I told him family helps family. There was something in the way she said it that rankled me, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was about my son, my grandchildren. Pride was a luxury I couldn't afford when their future was at stake. "What about the house?" I heard myself asking. "Even if we solve the immediate crisis, where will you live?" Neil and Avalon exchanged a look that I couldn't quite read. "We were hoping," Neil said slowly, "that maybe we could stay here with you. Just temporarily until we get back on our feet." My house, the 4-bedroom colonial that Harold and I had bought as newlyweds, where we'd raised Neil, where every corner held memories. It was too big for me now. That was true. The mortgage had been paid off for 15 years. "The kids love this house," Avalon added, her voice taking on a warmer tone. "They have so many memories here with Grandma. It would be stable for them during this transition." I looked at my son, my baby boy, now 43 years old and falling apart at my kitchen table. I thought about Emma, only 12, and Jake, just 9. They didn't deserve to suffer because of their father's mistakes. "Okay," I said quietly. Neil's head snapped up. "Okay? I'll give you the money. And you can move in here. We'll make it work." The relief on Neil's face was instant and overwhelming. He pushed back from the table and wrapped me in a hug so tight I could barely breathe. "Mom, I can't believe— Thank you. Thank you so much." Over his shoulder, I saw Avalon's expression. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't relief or gratitude, it was satisfaction. Pure, calculating satisfaction. But Neil was holding me, crying into my shoulder like he had as a little boy, and I told myself I was imagining things. Stress could make anyone look strange. "We'll need to do this quickly," Avalon said, her voice businesslike now. "The foreclosure proceedings are moving fast." The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. I liquidated my savings account, watching 40 years of careful accumulation disappear with a few signatures. The bank manager, Mrs. Henderson, who'd known me for 20 years, looked concerned. "Are you sure about this, Colleen? This is your entire nest egg." "It's for my family," I said firmly, though my hand shook as I signed the withdrawal slip. The house transfer was more complicated. My lawyer, Jim Patterson, had handled Harold's will and seemed genuinely worried. "Colleen, I have to ask, are you certain you want to sign the house over completely? We could arrange something more protective, maybe a shared ownership or—" "Jim," I interrupted, "my son needs stability. His children need a home. This is the right thing to do." Neil seemed uncomfortable with the lawyer's questions, shifting in his chair and avoiding eye contact. Avalon, however, was all smiles and gracious charm. "Mr. Patterson, we completely understand your concern for Colleen. That's exactly why we want this to be a family home where we can all take care of each other." But when Jim stepped out to make copies, I heard Avalon whisper to Neil, "The sooner we get this done, the better, before she changes her mind." The comment sent a chill down my spine, but when I looked at her, she was smiling warmly at me. "I was just telling Neil how grateful we are, Colleen. The children are so excited to live with Grandma." I forced myself to smile back, pushing down the growing unease in my chest. The day we finalized everything, Neil hugged me again. "Mom, you've saved us. I promise we'll make this work. We'll take care of you too." Avalon nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. We're family now, all under one roof. It'll be perfect." As I watched them drive away to collect their belongings, I stood in the doorway of what was no longer my house, feeling strangely hollow. I'd given them everything, my money, my home, my security. But instead of the warm glow of having helped my family, I felt an inexplicable dread. That night, I sat in what had been Harold's chair, looking around the living room where we'd celebrated Christmases and birthdays, where Neil had taken his first steps. Tomorrow, it would be full of boxes and new arrangements, new rules. I told myself I was being silly. This was what families did for each other. This was love in action. But as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I couldn't shake the image of Avalon's satisfied smile, or the cold calculation I'd glimpsed in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. I woke up to silence. After 3 weeks of living with Neil's family, the quiet felt wrong. There should have been the sound of Emma getting ready for school, Jake's cartoons playing downstairs, Avalon's coffee maker gurgling to life. Instead, there was nothing but an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I padded downstairs in my robe, calling out softly, "Neil? Avalon?" My voice echoed in the empty hallway, answered only by the tick of the grandfather clock Harold had bought for our 25th anniversary. The living room looked different, cleaner, too clean. The family photos that had cluttered the mantel were gone. Avalon's decorative vases had vanished from the side tables. Even the children's backpacks, which had lived by the front door, were nowhere to be seen. My hands started to shake. I rushed to the kitchen, hoping to find a note, some explanation. The counter was bare except for a single piece of paper folded in half. My name was scrawled across it in Avalon's sharp handwriting. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. The words hit me like a physical blow. "Colleen, thanks for everything. We sold the house yesterday and we're starting fresh somewhere new. Don't try to find us. P.S. Old loser, you stink." I read it 3 times before the words truly sank in. They sold the house. My house. The house I'd signed over to help them, to keep the family together. And they'd sold it without telling me, without even saying goodbye. The cruelty of that postscript, "Old loser, you stink," was so unexpected, so vicious, that I actually gasped aloud. This wasn't just abandonment. This was deliberate humiliation. I sank into the kitchen chair where Neil had sat crying just 3 weeks ago, begging for my help. The same chair where I'd made the decision to give up everything for him. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now homeless in what used to be my own home. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. House sale went through. New owners take possession Monday. You need to be out by Sunday. Today was Friday. The reality crashed over me in waves. I had no money. I'd given it all to Neil. I had no home. He'd sold it out from under me. I had nowhere to go and less than 3 days to figure it out. I tried calling Neil's number. Disconnected. Avalon's phone went straight to a voicemail box that was full. Their social media accounts had vanished overnight. They hadn't just left me. They'd erased themselves completely, covering their tracks like criminals. I sat at that kitchen table for hours, the note clutched in my hands, trying to understand how I'd been so completely fooled. Every conversation, every gesture of gratitude, every promise to take care of me, all of it had been lies. The worst part wasn't even the money or the house. It was the realization that my son, the baby I'd nursed through fevers and nightmares, the boy I'd cheered at baseball games, the man I'd thought I knew, had planned this betrayal. He'd looked me in the eye and lied with such conviction that I'd never suspected a thing. Around noon, Mrs. Henley from next door knocked on the front door. I could see her through the window, holding a casserole dish and wearing the concerned expression she usually reserved for funerals. "Colleen, I heard voices early this morning, saw the moving truck. Is everything all right?" Moving truck. They'd hired professional movers while I slept, quietly packing their lives away and disappearing like smoke. I opened the door, still clutching Avalon's note. Mrs. Henley took one look at my face and stepped inside without being invited. "Oh, honey, what happened?" The story came out in broken pieces. Mrs. Henley's expression shifted from concern to shock to outrage as I explained about the money, the house transfer, the overnight disappearance. "That's fraud," she said flatly. "You need to call the police." But what crime had they actually committed? I'd willingly given them the money and signed over the house. They'd never promised to let me live there forever. The cruelty was devastating, but it probably wasn't illegal. "What are you going to do?" Mrs. Henley asked gently. I honestly didn't know. At 68, with no savings and no home, my options were terrifyingly limited. I could probably stay in a motel for a few weeks, but then what? Senior apartments had waiting lists. My Social Security barely covered basic expenses, let alone rent in today's market. I might have to call the Salvation Army, I admitted, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "See if they have any emergency housing?" Henley's eyes filled with tears. "Colleen, you can stay with us while you figure things out. It's not much, but no," I said quickly. "I won't impose on your family. You've got your own troubles." But her kindness, after the calculated cruelty of my own family, nearly broke me. I excused myself to the bathroom and cried until my chest ached. That afternoon, I started packing my belongings into the old suitcases I'd stored in the attic. 40 years of life reduced to a few bags. I found myself touching things I'd taken for granted. Harold's reading glasses still on his nightstand, the quilt my mother had made for our wedding, photos of Neil at every stage of his life. How had that sweet little boy turned into someone who could do this to his own mother? I was folding Harold's favorite sweater when I found the first real estate listing on my phone. Someone had forwarded it to me, probably Mrs. Henley, trying to be helpful. It was my house, described in glowing terms. Charming colonial with original hardwood floors and vintage fixtures. The asking price was $340,000. I stared at the number until it blurred. They'd sold my house for nearly twice what I'd given them. After paying off their supposed debts, they'd walked away with a fortune, my fortune. But there was something else in the listing that made my blood run cold. In the property disclosure section, buried in legal jargon, was a note about ongoing structural assessments and potential foundation issues currently under investigation. Foundation issues. Structural problems. My heart started racing as pieces clicked into place. I grabbed my reading glasses and read the disclosure more carefully. There were mentions of settling concerns and recommended geological surveys and previous homeowner awareness of subsurface instability. I knew about the foundation problems. Of course I knew. Harold and I had discovered them 15 years ago when we'd tried to finish the basement. The whole house sat on what the engineer had called problematic soil composition. Fixing it would cost more than the house was worth, so we'd simply avoided the basement and hoped for the best. Neil knew about it too. He'd been with us when the engineer delivered his report. He'd seen the paperwork, heard the warnings about potential settling and structural compromise. So when I'd signed the house over to them, they'd inherited not just a property, but a massive liability that I'd never disclosed to any potential buyers. Suddenly, Avalon's satisfied smile made perfect sense. They hadn't just stolen from me. They'd stuck me with a worthless property while they fled with my money, except they hadn't fled fast enough. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Mrs. Morrison? This is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh & Associates Real Estate. I'm calling about the property at 47 Maple Street. We're representing the buyers, and there's been a significant development regarding the foundation inspection. I gripped the phone tighter. What kind of development? Well, ma'am, it appears there are some serious structural issues that weren't properly disclosed in the sale. The new owners are facing potentially hundreds of thousands in repairs, and they're exploring legal action against the sellers. My mouth went dry. Legal action? Yes, ma'am. Property fraud is a serious matter, especially when it involves concealing known defects. Do you happen to know how we might contact Mr. Neil Morrison and his wife? They seem to have disappeared, and we have some very urgent papers to serve. I looked down at Avalon's cruel note, at the words, "Old loser, you stink," and felt something shift inside me. For the first time since finding that note, I smiled. "I'm sorry," I said calmly. "I have no idea where they are." The Sunset Manor efficiency apartment smelled like disinfectant and old carpet. 1,800 square feet of my life reduced to 400 square feet of beige walls and fluorescent lighting. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring at the stack of legal papers that had been delivered that morning. 3 weeks had passed since I'd moved out of my house. 3 weeks of sleeping in this sterile box while lawyers and real estate agents called daily, asking questions I couldn't answer about Neil and Avalon's whereabouts. The papers in my lap were from the buyers of my house, the Hendersons, a young couple with twin toddlers who'd been planning to start their dream life in what they thought was a solid family home. Instead, they'd discovered that the foundation was slowly sinking, that the entire structure was compromised, and that the previous owners had vanished without a trace. Their lawyer was demanding information about Neil and Avalon. The insurance company was launching an investigation into potential fraud. The real estate agent was threatening legal action against everyone involved in the sale. And there I was, trapped in the middle of it all with nowhere to hide and no one to turn to. I'd spent the morning at the Social Security office, trying to understand my options. The caseworker, a tired-looking woman named Sandra, had reviewed my file with the kind of professional sympathy that somehow made everything worse. "Mrs. Morrison, I have to be honest with you. Your monthly benefit of $1,847 isn't going to cover much more than basic survival. Have you considered applying for housing assistance? What's the waiting list like?" I'd asked, though I already knew the answer would be devastating. For seniors in this area? About 18 months, maybe 2 years. 2 years. At 68, with my health already showing signs of the stress I'd been under, 2 years felt like a lifetime. The worst part was the isolation. Neil had been my primary connection to the world beyond my neighborhood. His children had been my main source of joy, my reason for getting up in the morning. Now they were gone, and I found myself wondering if Emma and Jake even knew what their parents had done to me. Did they think I'd simply chosen to disappear from their lives? Mrs. Henley still called occasionally, checking on me with the kind of gentle persistence that made my chest ache. She'd offered again to let me stay with them, but I couldn't bear the thought of being a burden. I'd already lost too much dignity to sacrifice what little remained. The depression crept in slowly, like water rising in a basement. Some mornings, I couldn't find a reason to get out of bed. The apartment's kitchenette mocked me with its single burner and mini fridge. I'd gone from cooking Sunday dinners for my family to heating canned soup for one. I'd started talking to Harold's picture, propped on my nightstand beside the few possessions I'd managed to salvage. I really messed up this time, I told his smiling face one particularly dark evening. You always said I trusted too easily. You were right. The silence that answered me was worse than any argument we'd ever had. I tried to piece together the signs I'd missed, the red flags I'd chosen to ignore, Avalon's constant comments about the house being too big for me, Neil's sudden interest in my financial situation after years of barely staying in touch, the way they'd rushed the paperwork, discouraging me from having my own lawyer review everything. How had I been so blind? The phone rang, startling me from my spiraling thoughts. I almost didn't answer. Most calls these days were from lawyers or collection agencies trying to track down Neil. Mrs. Morrison? This is Detective Martinez with the County Fraud Unit. I was hoping we could schedule a time to talk. My blood turned to ice. About what? About the property transfer and subsequent sale of 47 Maple Street. We've opened an investigation based on complaints from the current property owners. I haven't done anything wrong, I said quickly, though my voice shook. No, ma'am, I don't believe you have. But we need to understand the full scope of what happened. There are some irregularities in the paperwork that suggest this wasn't a standard family transfer. Irregularities. The word echoed in my mind long after I hung up. What had Neil and Avalon done beyond stealing my house and money? What other lies had they told? What other laws had they broken while using me as their unwitting accomplice? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the narrow bed, listening to my upstairs neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls, and tried to remember exactly what Neil had told me about his debts. The more I thought about it, the more holes appeared in his story. He'd claimed the house was in foreclosure, but I'd never seen any official papers. He'd said lawyers were involved, but he'd never given me their names or contact information. He'd painted a picture of financial ruin so convincing that I'd handed over my life savings without asking for proof. What if the debts had been a lie? What if they'd simply wanted my money and my house, and they'd manufactured a crisis to get them? The thought was so devastating that I actually felt sick. If Neil had never been in real trouble, if this had all been an elaborate con, then my sacrifice had been meaningless. Worse than meaningless, it had been the act of a fool. I got up and made myself a cup of tea with shaking hands, then sat at the tiny table by the window. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for a few cars belonging to other residents who, like me, had nowhere else to go. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window, a pale, thin woman who looked older than her 68 years. The woman in the glass bore little resemblance to the confident person I'd been just a month ago, when I'd had a home and savings and a family. That woman had been naive, but she'd also been loved. Or so she'd thought. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, looking for someone to call. The list was pitifully short. Most of the entries were businesses or acquaintances rather than real friends. Harold and I had been homebodies, content with each other's company. Neil had been our social life, our connection to the future. Without him, I was truly alone. The next morning brought another phone call from Detective Martinez. This time, he wasn't asking for a meeting. He was informing me that Neil and Avalon had been located. They're in Costa Rica, he said. We're working with international authorities to determine our options for extradition. Costa Rica? The words came out as a whisper. Yes, ma'am. Apparently, they've been there for several weeks. They purchased property there shortly after the sale of your house. Of course they had. While I was sleeping on a narrow bed in a efficiency apartment, worrying about how to afford groceries, they were living in paradise on money that had been mine. Mrs. Morrison, I need to ask you some difficult questions about the condition of the house when you transferred ownership. The buyers are claiming that significant structural problems were concealed during the sale. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what I was about to admit. I knew about the foundation issues. You knew? My husband and I discovered them years ago. We never fixed them because the cost was prohibitive. Neil knew about them too. He was there when we got the engineer's report. There was a long pause. Mrs. Morrison, did you disclose these issues to your son when you transferred the property? No, I said quietly. I thought they were going to live there. I thought it would be a family home. I never imagined they would sell it. Another pause. Longer this time. Ma'am, I think you need to speak with a lawyer. It's possible that you're a victim here, not a perpetrator, but the situation is complex, and you need legal representation. A victim. The word should have provided some comfort, but instead, it only reinforced how completely I'd been destroyed. I was a victim without resources, without family, without hope of recovery. After I hung up, I sat in my chair by the window and watched the world go by outside. Other people living their normal lives, going to work, visiting family, secure in their homes and relationships. I envied them their certainty, their trust in the people they loved. But as the day wore on, something began to shift inside me. The despair was still there, but underneath it, I felt the first stirrings of something else: anger. Neil and Avalon were living in Costa Rica on my money, probably laughing about the old loser they'd left behind. They thought they'd won, thought they'd gotten away with it. They had no idea what they'd actually done to themselves. The law office of Peterson and Associates occupied the third floor of a modest building downtown. Nothing like the glossy corporate firms I'd seen on television. Sarah Peterson was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her cluttered desk. "Detective Martinez filled me in on the basics of your situation. I have to say, this is one of the more unusual cases I've encountered." Unusual. That seemed to be the theme of my life lately. "I want to be upfront with you," Sarah continued, opening a thick file folder. "I'm taking this case pro bono because I believe you've been victimized. But the legal landscape here is complicated." Over the next hour, she walked me through the maze of laws and regulations that Neil and Avalon had potentially violated: property fraud, elder abuse, concealment of material defects, possible mail fraud if they'd used false information in any of their paperwork. "The good news," Sarah said, "is that the buyers of your house aren't pursuing action against you personally. Their insurance company has determined that you are likely an unwitting participant in the fraud." I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. "And the bad news?" "The bad news is that recovering your losses is going to be difficult. Even if we can prove fraud, your son and daughter-in-law appear to have moved most of the money offshore." She pulled out another document, this one with an official seal at the top. "However, there's been an interesting development. The Costa Rican authorities have frozen several bank accounts linked to your son and his wife." My heart jumped. Why? Because they made a critical error. When they purchased property in Costa Rica, they had to declare the source of their funds. They claimed the money came from the sale of a family property that had been gifted to them. But when the Costa Rican bank did their due diligence, they discovered the foundation problems and the ongoing legal issues. Sarah leaned forward, her expression growing more animated. "Here's where it gets interesting. Costa Rica has very strict laws about foreign nationals bringing in money from potentially fraudulent real estate transactions. They take it seriously because they don't want their country used as a haven for international property scams." So they're in trouble there too? More than trouble. They're facing potential criminal charges in Costa Rica for money laundering. The property they bought has been seized, and they're not allowed to leave the country while the investigation continues. For the first time in weeks, I felt something that might have been hope. What does that mean for me? It means we have leverage, and it means they're probably desperate to resolve this situation before the Costa Rican authorities decide to prosecute. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed me a news article from a Costa Rican English-language newspaper. The headline read, "American couple detained in property fraud investigation." Below it was a photo of Neil and Avalon being escorted from what looked like a police station. Seeing them in handcuffs should have made me sad. Neil was still my son, still the little boy I'd raised and loved. But all I felt was a cold satisfaction. They looked terrified and disheveled, nothing like the confident criminals who disappeared with my life savings. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling my attention back to the conversation. "The foundation problems with your house? They're worse than anyone initially realized." She handed me an engineering report that had been commissioned by the new owner's insurance company. I scanned the technical language, struggling to understand the implications. What does this mean in plain English? "It means the house is essentially uninhabitable. The foundation has shifted so much that the entire structure is compromised. The repair costs are estimated at over $400,000, more than the house is worth. I stared at the report, remembering Harold's worried face 15 years ago when the first engineer had delivered his assessment. We knew it was bad, but not this bad. The interesting thing is the timeline, Sarah continued. According to this report, the deterioration accelerated significantly in the past 5 years. What that means is that your son and daughter-in-law were living in a house that was literally falling down around them, and they knew it. But they never said anything to me? Because they were planning this all along. Think about it. They could have asked you for help with repairs, could have worked with you to address the foundation issues properly. Instead, they waited until the house became your liability, then disappeared with your money while leaving you responsible for a worthless property. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. This wasn't a desperate act by people in crisis. This was a long-term plan to defraud me while destroying my life in the process. There's more, Sarah said gently. We've been investigating your son's financial history. The debts he claimed to have, the foreclosure proceedings, there's no record of any of it. I felt the room spin slightly. None of it was real? None of it. In fact, based on what we can determine, Neil and Avalon have been financially stable for years. They both had good jobs, a decent savings account, and no significant debts beyond normal household expenses. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. Every tear Neil had shed in my kitchen, every desperate plea for help, every promise to pay me back, all of it had been theater. Why? I whispered. Why would they do this to me? Sarah's expression softened. From what we can piece together, they'd been planning to leave the country for some time. They needed liquid capital to purchase property abroad and establish themselves in Costa Rica. Your house and savings represented an easy source of funding. Easy, I repeated bitterly. I'm sorry, I know how difficult this must be to hear. I looked out the window at the busy street below, watching people hurry past with their everyday concerns and normal families. What happens now? Now we have some choices. The Costa Rican authorities are willing to work with us if your son and daughter-in-law agree to make restitution. They want this resolved quickly to avoid an international incident. And if they don't agree, then they face prosecution in Costa Rica, which could mean years in prison and complete forfeiture of their assets. Either way, you're likely to recover at least some of your losses. Sarah handed me another document. This one marked Settlement Proposal. They've already indicated through their Costa Rican lawyer that they're willing to negotiate. I looked at the numbers on the page. It wasn't everything I'd lost, but it was enough to give me back some semblance of security. There's one more thing, Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. The settlement would require you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. You wouldn't be able to discuss the details of what happened publicly. They want to buy my silence. Essentially, yes. The question is whether that's acceptable to you. I thought about Avalon's cruel note, about the weeks I'd spent in that sterile apartment wondering if I'd die alone and forgotten. I thought about the fear and desperation they'd put me through, the way they'd made me question my own judgment and worth. Money could restore my financial security, but it couldn't undo the emotional damage they'd caused. I need to think about it, I said finally. Sarah nodded. Take your time, but don't take too long. The Costa Rican authorities won't hold them indefinitely, and if they're released, recovering anything becomes much more difficult. That evening, back in my efficiency apartment, I sat with the settlement documents spread across my tiny table. The numbers were generous, more than enough to buy a small house, rebuild my savings, and live comfortably for the rest of my life. But something bothered me about the non-disclosure clause. It felt like they were trying to erase what they'd done to buy the right to never be held accountable for their cruelty. My phone rang. Mrs. Henley calling for her weekly check-in. How are you holding up, dear? I told her about the settlement offer, about Neil and Avalon's arrest in Costa Rica, about the possibility of getting my money back. That's wonderful news, she exclaimed. You must be so relieved. I am, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. But? Mrs. Henley had always been perceptive. But it feels like they're getting away with it. A slap on the wrist and then they go back to their lives while I try to rebuild mine. Colleen, she said gently. Sometimes the best revenge is simply moving on and being happy despite what they did to you. She was right, of course. But as I looked at Harold's picture on my nightstand, I couldn't shake the feeling that accepting the settlement would be letting them win. They thought they knew me, thought I was just a weak old woman they could exploit and discard. They had no idea what they'd awakened when they decided to destroy my life. Maybe it was time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. I didn't sign the settlement papers that night. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called in sick to my volunteer work at the library and spent the entire day researching. If Neil and Avalon thought they could buy their way out of this mess, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The more I dug into Costa Rican property laws, the more interesting things became. The country had implemented strict regulations about foreign property ownership after several high-profile cases of Americans using fraudulent money to purchase real estate. What Neil and Avalon had stumbled into wasn't just a civil matter. It was a criminal investigation that could result in permanent deportation and lifetime bans from re-entering the country. But there was something else. Something that made my blood run cold when I fully understood its implications. I called Sarah Peterson the next morning. I need to ask you about the foundation problems. You said the deterioration accelerated in the past 5 years? That's correct. The engineering report shows significant settling that appears to have begun around 2019. Sarah, Neil, and Avalon moved into that house in 2020. They've been living there for 3 years. Knowing the foundation was failing, there was a pause on the other end of the line. What are you getting at, Colleen? I'm getting at the fact that they didn't just know about the foundation problems when they took the house from me. They caused them to get worse. I explained what I'd remembered during my sleepless night. The basement renovations Neil had insisted on doing himself. The way he'd dismissed my concerns about cracks appearing in the walls. The mysterious water damage that had required extensive repairs that I'd been told were too technical for me to understand. He wasn't trying to fix anything, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. He was making it worse. Deliberately. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Colleen, what you're suggesting is that your son intentionally damaged the property to reduce its value before transferring it to himself. And then lied about debts and foreclosure to manipulate me into giving it to him for nothing. That's not just fraud. That's criminal conspiracy spanning multiple years. Can you prove it? I think we can. The engineering report includes photos of the damage, and some of it definitely looks like it could be the result of intentional interference rather than natural settling. If we can get the contractor records for the work Neil claimed to be doing. My hands were shaking, but not from fear this time. From rage, pure, white-hot rage at the depth of their betrayal. There's something else, I said. The water damage I mentioned? Neil told me the insurance company covered most of it, but I had to pay a $5,000 deductible. I gave him the money. Do you have records of that payment? I have the check stub. He said the insurance company required it to be made out to the restoration company directly. What was the name of the company? I dug through my file of important papers until I found it. Avalon Restoration Services. Dead silence on the other end of the line. Sarah? Colleen? I need you to sit down. Avalon Restoration Services was incorporated in Delaware 3 years ago. The sole owner is listed as Avalon Morrison, your daughter-in-law. The room started to spin. They hadn't just stolen from me once. They'd been systematically defrauding me for years, creating fake emergencies and phantom businesses to extract money while simultaneously destroying the value of my property. How much? I whispered. I'll need to do a full audit, but based on what you've told me, we're looking at potentially tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent charges over the past 3 years. I thought about all the times Neil had called with urgent repair needs. All the cash I'd handed over without question because I trusted my son. All the times Avalon had been so grateful for my help, while she was literally stealing from me. They played a long game, I said, more to myself than to Sarah. A very long game, and a very stupid one, because now we have a paper trail going back years. That afternoon, Sarah and I met with Detective Martinez again, this time with a stack of evidence that painted a picture of calculated, long-term elder abuse and fraud. The detective's expression grew grimmer as we laid out the timeline. This changes everything, he said finally. We're not talking about a desperate couple making bad decisions. This is organized criminal activity. What does that mean for the Costa Rican situation? Sarah asked. It means we're going to request extradition for prosecution here. The charges we can file now are much more serious than anything they're facing there. He turned to me. Mrs. Morrison, I want you to understand what this means. If we pursue this course, your son could be looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Your daughter-in-law could face similar charges. This isn't a slap on the wrist anymore. The weight of it hit me like a physical blow. Neil, my little boy, could spend the rest of his 30s and possibly his 40s in prison. Emma and Jake would grow up with their father behind bars. What about my grandchildren? I asked quietly. Child services in Costa Rica is already involved because of the arrests. The children are currently staying with a family friend, but if their parents are extradited, he didn't need to finish. Emma and Jake would become casualties of their parents' greed. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at Harold's picture, trying to imagine what he would have said about all of this. He'd always been protective of Neil, maybe too protective, but he'd also believed in consequences. What should I do? I asked his smiling face. They destroyed my life, but they're still my family. The silence was deafening. I was still awake when my phone rang at 11 p.m., an international number that I almost didn't answer. Mom? Neil's voice was barely a whisper, strained and desperate in a way that took me back to his childhood nightmares. Neil, Mom, please. I know what you must think of me, but I need you to listen. I'm listening. The lawyers here say you're not signing the settlement. They say you're trying to get us extradited. Mom, please. Emma and Jake are scared. They don't understand what's happening. I closed my eyes, picturing my grandchildren's faces. Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to rob me blind. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were going to pay you back. I swear. We just needed to get established here, and then we were going to make sure you were taken care of. With what money, Neil? The money you stole from me? We made mistakes. I know that. But Mom, if you let them extradite us, the kids will have nobody. They'll end up in foster care. The manipulation was so blatant it made me sick. Even now, facing serious prison time, he was trying to use my love for my grandchildren to escape consequences. You should have thought about that before you spent 3 years systematically destroying my life. 3 years? Mom, what are you talking about? Avalon Restoration Services ring a bell? Silence. The fake water damage, the unnecessary repairs, the deliberate sabotage of the foundation. I know everything, Neil. When he spoke again, his voice was different, harder, more like Avalon's. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can, and I will. You're really going to destroy your own family over money? The question hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of every sacrifice I'd ever made for him. Every time I'd put his needs before my own. You destroyed this family the day you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive, I said quietly. The day you decided your own mother was nothing more than a bank account to be emptied. Mom, I'm not your mother anymore. Neil, mothers protect their children. They don't systematically rob them and leave them homeless. I hung up before he could respond. The next morning, I called Sarah Peterson. I'm not signing the settlement. File whatever charges you can file. Are you sure? Once we start this process, there's no going back. I thought about Avalon's note, about the years of fake emergencies and manufactured crises, about the cold calculation behind their every move. I'm sure. And the grandchildren? The grandchildren deserve better parents than the ones they have. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness, exactly, but something close to it. Peace. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't running from the truth or trying to protect people who had never deserved my protection. Neil and Avalon had made their choices. Now they would live with the consequences. And so would I. But for the first time in months, those consequences felt like freedom rather than punishment. 18 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new house, making coffee in the early morning light. The house was smaller than my old one, a tidy 2-bedroom cottage with a garden just big enough for my roses. But it was mine, truly mine. Bought with money, recovered through the federal prosecution of Neil and Avalon, plus damages awarded by the court for elder abuse and fraud. The morning news was playing on the small television I'd mounted under the cabinets. I wasn't really watching until I heard the anchor mention Costa Rica and extradition. I turned up the volume just in time to catch the tail end of a story about American citizens being returned to face fraud charges. Neil and Avalon had been extradited 6 months ago. The trial had been swift and decisive. The paper trail of their crimes was too extensive to dispute. Neil received 7 years in federal prison. Avalon got 5. Their assets, including the Costa Rican property purchased with my money, had been seized and liquidated to pay restitution. I should have felt satisfied. Justice had been served, the criminals punished, the victim compensated. But mostly what I felt was tired. The hardest part hadn't been testifying against them. It hadn't even been seeing Neil in his orange jumpsuit during sentencing, looking like a stranger wearing my son's face. The hardest part had been the phone call from Emma 2 months after her parents' arrest. "Grandma Colleen? This is Emma." My heart had nearly stopped. My granddaughter, now 14, calling from a foster home in San Jose where she and Jake had been placed when Child Services determined that no relatives were available to take them. "Emma, sweetheart, how are you?" "I'm okay. Jake's okay too. We're with a nice family, and they're helping us with our English and Spanish." The pause that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. "Grandma, I need to ask you something. Did Mom and Dad really steal from you?" I'd closed my eyes, searching for words that could explain the inexplicable to a child who'd lost everything. "Yes, sweetheart, they did. The lady from Child Services said they took your house and all your money. She said that's why they can't come home." "That's right." Another pause. "Are you mad at us? For what they did?" The question had broken my heart in ways I didn't know were possible. "Oh, honey, no, I'm not mad at you. I could never be mad at you." "Then why?" Her voice had wavered. "Why didn't you try to bring us home? The lawyer said you could have asked for custody." And there it was. The question I'd been dreading, the decision that haunted my sleepless nights. "Emma, I wanted to. I wanted to so badly. But I'm 69 years old, and I was living in a tiny apartment with no money. I couldn't take care of you the way you deserved. We wouldn't have minded being poor with you." The simplicity of her statement, the faith it implied, had nearly destroyed me. "I know, sweetheart. But sometimes love means wanting better for someone than what you can give them." We'd talked for an hour that day, and I'd learned that the foster family was wonderful. A bilingual couple with grown children of their own who specialized in helping American kids navigate the Costa Rican system. Emma was learning Spanish, Jake was playing soccer, and they were both doing well in school. They were building a life without me, without their parents, without any of the family they'd been born into. I'd sent money for their expenses, of course. Christmas and birthday gifts. Care packages filled with American snacks and books, but I hadn't seen them since that day they'd disappeared from my house, and I probably never would again. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured myself a cup, adding cream from the little pitcher that had been my mother's. Simple pleasures were more meaningful now that I'd lost and regained the ability to afford them. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Henley, who had become my closest friend in the aftermath of everything. She checked on me daily, invited me to her family dinners, and never once said, "I told you so," about Neil and Avalon, though she'd had her suspicions from the beginning. "Coffee this morning. I have news about the Peterson girl." Mrs. Henley's niece was getting married, and she'd been planning the celebration for months. Normal family drama, the kind I'd once taken for granted and now envied with an intensity that sometimes surprised me. I texted back, "Come over. I'll make breakfast." 20 minutes later, she was at my door with a box of pastries from the bakery downtown and her usual morning energy. "You look better," she said, studying my face as I let her in. "More rested." It was true. The nightmares had finally stopped, and I was sleeping through the night for the first time in 2 years. The constant anxiety about money, about housing, about what Neil and Avalon might do next, all of it was gone. "I feel better," I admitted, leading her to the kitchen table. "Lighter, somehow." That's what happens when you stop carrying other people's guilt. Mrs. Henley had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things. She'd been the one to point out that I'd been apologizing for Neil and Avalon's crimes, as if I'd committed them myself. "Any word from the kids?" she asked gently, settling into her chair. "Emma emails sometimes. They're doing well, really well actually, better than I'd hoped. But I miss them. I miss the people I thought they were going to become with me in their lives." Mrs. Henley reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Maybe that's not over yet. They're young. When they're older, when they understand more about what happened." "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. But I can't live my life waiting for maybes. And that was the truth I'd finally accepted. Emma and Jake might choose to reconnect with me someday, or they might decide that I was too connected to the worst chapter of their lives. Either way, I couldn't spend my remaining years paralyzed by guilt over choices I'd made in impossible circumstances. "Speaking of not waiting," Mrs. Henley said, pulling an envelope from her purse, "I have something for you." The envelope was cream-colored, heavy paper with elegant script addressing. Inside was an invitation to her niece's wedding, with a handwritten note at the bottom. "Please come. Your family now. Sarah." I looked up at Mrs. Henley, who was trying not to smile. "Family? You saved my life when Tom had his heart attack last year. You've been there for every crisis and celebration since. That makes you family in my book." It was true. I'd become the emergency contact for Mrs. Henley's medical appointments, the person she called when she needed help with technology, the one who brought soup when she was sick. Somewhere along the way, without either of us planning it, we'd become each other's chosen family. "Besides," she continued, "Sarah specifically asked for you to be there. She said you're proof that it's possible to start over after everything falls apart." After breakfast, Mrs. Henley left to run errands, and I spent the morning in my garden. The roses I'd transplanted from my old house had not only survived, but thrived in their new location. They seemed to bloom more vibrantly now, as if they too had benefited from escaping that poisoned ground. I was deadheading the peace roses when my phone rang. An unknown number with a familiar area code, Costa Rica. For a moment, I considered not answering. The chapter of my life that included Costa Rica was closed, and I had no desire to reopen it. But something made me pick up. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Miguel Santos. I'm a social worker with the American Citizen Services here in San Jose." My heart clenched. "Is it Emma? Jake? Are they all right?" "They're fine, ma'am. More than fine. That's actually why I'm calling. Emma asked me to contact you." "She asked you to call me?" "Yes, ma'am. She's graduating from high school next month. Valedictorian of her class. She wanted you to know. Valedictorian. My granddaughter, who'd lost everything at 12 years old, had not only survived, but excelled. She also wanted me to tell you that she's been accepted to university in the United States. Full scholarship to study international relations at Georgetown." I sat down heavily on my garden bench, overwhelmed by pride and grief in equal measure. "She's moving back to the United States? This fall, yes. She'll be in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. 3 hours by train from my new home. Close enough to visit, if she wanted to see me." "Mr. Santos, did she say anything else?" "She said to tell you that she understands now why you made the choices you made, and that she hopes someday you can meet the woman she's become." I ended the call and sat in my garden for a long time, tears streaming down my face. But for the first time in 2 years, they weren't tears of grief or regret. They were tears of possibility. That evening, I called Sarah Peterson to thank her for everything she'd done. The conversation reminded me of how far I'd come from the broken woman who'd first walked into her office. "You know," Sarah said, "I've been thinking about writing an article about elder abuse cases like yours. With your permission, of course. What would you say? That the strongest thing a victim can do is refuse to stay a victim. That justice isn't just about punishment. It's about reclaiming your own life." After I hung up, I walked through my small house, turning on lamps against the gathering darkness. Every room was decorated with things I'd chosen, arranged the way I wanted them. No one else's needs or preferences to consider. No one else's chaos to manage. For most of my adult life, That would have felt like loneliness. Now it felt like freedom. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it while reading a book I'd chosen purely because it interested me. No family drama to navigate, no crises to solve, no one else's emotions to manage. Later, as I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who'd stood in this same spot a year ago. Older, yes, but stronger, more solid, more present in her own life. Neil and Avalon had tried to erase me, to reduce me to nothing more than a source of money and shelter. They'd almost succeeded. But I was still here, battered but not broken, changed but not destroyed. And that, I realized, was the best revenge of all. Tomorrow, I would start planning a trip to Georgetown University in the fall. Maybe Emma would want to see me, maybe she wouldn't. But I would be there, available if she needed me, ready to meet the remarkable woman my granddaughter had become despite everything. I turned off the lights and climbed into my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by the peaceful silence of a life that finally belonged entirely to me. For the first time in decades, I fell asleep smiling. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.